The topic which I have chosen to speak on is globalization and the pandemic. When we talk of globalization, what is so unique about the contemporary globalization, which is different from all earlier episodes of globalization, is that it is associated with a globalization of finance. Now, this is not just a question of goods, capital, including finance, being able to move across country borders, but they're actually moving around. Finance is currently moving around at a dizzying pace, huge amounts of it across country borders. So we have a real process of globalization of finance. The amount of finance, the cross-border flows are several times the trade-related movements that we normally talk about. In other words, the trade-unrelated movements really are many more times compared to trade-related movements. Now, therefore, if you have globalization of finance, this has some very important implications. The first one is that, after all, we live in a world of nation states. Basically, political authority resides with a state that is confined to the nation. The government of that state is elected by the people belonging to that particular, the jurisdiction of that state, once every so often. The state does not do what finance likes it to do. Suppose the state actually takes some measures which suppose the state takes some measures which actually mean that it's not liked by finance. In that case, finance would just leave that country, creating a massive crisis for that particular country. Therefore, willy-nilly, the state has to pursue policies which are to the liking of finance. Therefore, the state, no matter which government there is, as long as the country is locked into this process of globalization of finance, that government would have to pursue a set of policies which are to the liking of finance. Now, this, of course, has very important implications for democracy, for sovereignty, but above all, for economic policies. As a matter of fact, John Maynard Keynes, the well-known English economist of the 20th century, was of the view, he was aware of the fact that if finance became global, while the state continued to remain the nation state, then the state's writ would not run against finance. On the other hand, the state would have to listen to what finance wants it to do. Therefore, he had said that finance, above all, must be national, that the jurisdiction of the state and the jurisdiction of financial flows must actually coincide. And it is for this reason that in the Bretton Woods system, which Keynes had helped to devise after the Second World War, countries were allowed to impose controls on capital flows across their borders. Capital coming in or going out could be controlled, and that was true of finance as well. And therefore, in some sense, the writ of the state could run. But now with globalization of finance, that is no longer the case. And therefore, we have, in a certain very important way, an enfeeblement of the nation state. It has to kowtow to the will of globalized finance. Now, this manifests itself in a number of ways. For instance, we have fiscal responsibility legislation, which means that there's a control on the magnitude of fiscal deficit as a proportion of GDP. Now, this basically means that the state's hands are tied. Even if there is a recession, even if there is massive unemployment, there is nothing that the state can do in fiscal terms to actually get rid of this unemployment. This is something which has no theoretical basis. This is something which John Robinson, the well-known economist, had called the humbug of finance. Finance doesn't like fiscal deficits. And therefore, but nonetheless, all over the world, with the exception of the United States, you actually find governments passing legislation controlling the magnitude of fiscal deficit, which actually makes government policy pro-cyclical rather than anti-cyclical. In a period in which, let's say, there's a recession, output goes down, employment goes down, government's tax revenue goes down, but because of the control on the fiscal deficit, you find that the government's expenditure also goes down, which contributes to the contraction in the economy. And that's one very obvious way. The other way is, for instance, there's a curtailment of welfare expenditures on health, education, public expenditure on health, education, and all these things. Obviously, because of the fact that in order to continue spending on the scale that the state was doing earlier, it'll have to keep raising taxes. But on the other hand, finance insists that the taxation burden on itself and upon capitalists generally must be lowered, which is what we have been seeing, for instance, in our own country. And once that happens, you can, of course, tax workers, you can tax ordinary people, but then their net benefit is negligible. If they pay taxes, then whatever the government spends by way of public health care and public education is something that comes back to them. But on the other hand, they are not net gainers. So if there is going to be any redistributive welfare measures, then it is essential that the state should be able to tax the rich. But that is not acceptable to finance, which is why states generally have not been taxing the rich, and which is also why you find, or whatever taxes they were, have been coming down, which is why you find that there is actually an increase in income and wealth inequalities over the last several decades. Yet again, you'd find, for instance, that there is privatization of all kinds of services, including, again, health services, education, and so on. Because since the state cannot spend, then it becomes essential for the state to actually to encourage the private sector to undertake expenditure on these kinds of activities. Now, these are all quite well known. But they are well known not because, they're well known, but their cause lies not in the willful malice on the part of the government so much. Some governments may well be malicious, but not so much because of the willful malice on the part of the governments, but because of the structure of the contemporary globalization, whereby finance is globalized and therefore has a decisive say against the nation state, of which the government is a component. What we call neoliberal policies are basically a reflection of this hegemony of finance, because these neoliberal policies are those which are generally approved of by finance. Now, the deleterious effects of this kind of neoliberal policy, this kind of financial hegemony pushing the state in a certain direction, have been obvious for a very long time. In fact, in the current crisis, for instance, economic crisis, I'm not talking about the COVID-19 crisis. Even before that, we know that in the economic crisis, there is very little that the state could do. If fiscal means of stimulating activity are ruled out, then the only means available to the state is monetary policy. Now, in monetary policy, you can actually lower your interest rate. You kept lowering the interest rate. Now in Europe, in fact, you lowered it to negative levels in order to make sure that somehow people start spending, start investing, and so on. But nonetheless, the crisis continued. But while this was happening, the very obvious way of stimulating an economy by the state undertaking expenditures is something that was ruled out because that was not to the liking of globalized finance. Therefore, the deleterious effects, and I mentioned the increase in income and wealth inequalities, and all these have been manifesting themselves for a very long time. And the fact that they arise because of the character of the contemporary globalization is something which has been known for quite some time. But what the COVID-19 crisis has done is that it has actually brought all this to a head. That basically now the contrast between what is in the interests of the people and what is liked by finance and what finance allows the government to do, that contrast, that contradiction has actually become obvious and has reached a head. Just give you one example. In our own country, for instance, you have the government announcing a relief package, which was trivial 1.7 lakh crores, which is 0.7% of the GDP. And this was announced during the first round of the lockdown, which actually ended on the 14th of April. After that, the government extended the lockdown for 3 weeks more, but no supplementary package was actually announced. In other words, the government has really, while imposing a draconian lockdown on the people, which has meant that they're without incomes, they're without a roof on their heads, they're without food, many of them are herded into quarantine camps. Nonetheless, the government does not help them, and the total amount of help that is given to them is peanuts, is a trivial sum. And one of the very important reasons for it, of course, governments themselves have to be more sensitive and so on, ours is not. But we must not also lose sight of the constraint that the structure of globalization places upon this particular government, which does not which is not willing to flout the dictates of finance for reasons that this might actually take the economy along a difficult route. Had it had the courage, it would have actually defied finance, imposed capital controls, imposed controls on financial flows, and done something for the people, but actually it sacrifices the interests of the people in order to appease finance, because that is the way that it feels. That is the way that its pusillanimity, lack of courage, drives it. But the important thing is this conflict. The important thing is the conflict between the people's interests on the one hand and the interests of the finance on the other hand. Finance does not like a state to be active in its intervention on behalf of the people, while there are occasions, now is one, when such an intervention becomes absolutely necessary. Of course, in European countries or in the other advanced countries, actually the governments have been much more sympathetic to the plight of the people. And while taking measures against this pandemic, they have come out with relief packages for the people, which actually have gone beyond the normal neoliberal norms. For instance, there is a 5% of GDP relief package in Germany. In the US now, the package, not only relief, but relief come rescue package, is about $3 trillion, which is approximately 15% of the GDP. Remember, ours is 0.7%, compared to which the US has a 15% of the GDP relief come rescue package. Germany has 5% of GDP. Japan has 20% of GDP. So ours is one of the most conservative. But on the other hand, I'm most conservative because most scared. But on the other hand, everywhere, the governments have come out with some kinds of packages. But on the other hand, all of it, whether the governments have been somewhat bolder in coming out with packages for the relief of the people, for rescuing the economy, or whether the governments have been more timid, like here, all of it really is capturing a scenario in which the conflict between the interests of finance and the interests of the people has really come to a head. And that is the scenario in which we are currently placed. In Spain, for instance, because of this, the government has even, for the time being, commandeered private hospitals where patients can be treated as they are in public hospitals. Private hospitals can't charge the patients like public hospitals don't. The National Health Service in Britain, which was quite well known, has been run down in this neoliberal period, because of which now they say that their capacity to cope with this pandemic has gone down greatly. So the neoliberal policies have actually been deleterious for quite some time. This has reached a head now. When it has reached a head, you actually find two kinds of responses, namely some who are timid, like our government, others who actually have deviated from the neoliberal norms in order to bring larger, more ambitious relief come rescue packages. Now, this becomes particularly important in the current context because while our government has actually made it clear that they are going to respect the fiscal deficit targets they have placed for themselves, it becomes particularly important because of the fact that at this very moment, there is a huge outflow of finance from all third world countries, including India. In India, we know that the rupee has been collapsing, that generally asset prices as well as the exchange rate are going down. The rupee now has reached a level which is unprecedented vis-a-vis the dollar. That's because, not because of anything our government has done or our country has done or our economy has done, but that's to do with the fact that whenever there is any kind of nervousness in the financial markets, finance tends to rush back to its home base, which is in the advanced countries, which is in the metropolis, and in particular, it rushes back to dollars and dollar-denominated assets. This is exactly what is happening now. Now, given this extreme conflict which has arisen, and of course, the fact that finance moves out again implies that, okay, if it moves out, if the exchange rate falls, then it becomes more difficult. Less for the time being. In India, we have a lot of foreign exchange reserves, but it becomes more difficult for lots and lots of third world countries to service their debt, to manage their balance of payments. In fact, 102 countries have approached the IMF for loans. And when they get loans from the IMF, in order to manage their balance of payments, they have to pursue further deflationary measures. That's typically what the IMF insists upon. And that would mean larger unemployment and so on. So as I've been saying, the conflict between the interests of finance on the one hand and the interests of the people on the other hand has now reached really an acute stage. Now, in this conflict, of course, as I said, temporary ad hoc retreats from neoliberalism have been pursued by some. But of course, this raises the whole question that what happens now? That what is the regime that we are going to have? That are we going to continue with this regime of globalization, hoping that once the pandemic is over, then all these would actually just kind of disappear, all these problems which have arisen? Or is it the case that actually the world economy now needs an alternative regime? I think there are two broad approaches to this, two broad strategic perspectives on this. One perspective, which many countries are following, including ours, I regret to say, is really in this conflict between the interests of the people and the interests of finance, appease finance and suppress the people. Now, one very obvious, and I suspect as time proceeds, as the conflict in our country also becomes more and more acute, the suppression of the people is going to increase. Now, that is the authoritarian path which our country has taken and many other countries are taking. In fact, they are using the COVID-19 related lockdown as a way of suppressing freedoms, as a way of imposing, in quotes, discipline on the people, as a way of dividing the people along all kinds of racist or communal lines, in order to continue to retain the hegemony of finance, so that there is no attack that is being made on the position of finance and on the nature of globalization, which we have experienced until now. Now, there are various symptoms of this. The fact that our government has said that we are going to respect our fiscal deficit targets. The fact that they have actually delayed the payment of DNS allowance to central government employees, the fact that they have delayed the payment of pensions to central government pensioners are symptoms that actually they are now willing, even if some amount of relief is provided, this relief would be financed not by violating the fiscal deficit norms, not by monetizing the fiscal deficit by the government borrowing from the Reserve Bank of India, but by cutting down expenditures, and typically cutting down expenditures which were oriented towards the working population, towards pensioners, towards government employees, and so on. Now, this is the path which wishes to maintain the current nature of globalization, which wishes to maintain the current hegemony of finance, but it does so at the expense of the working people. The other path, which many European countries are talking about, is one which actually tries to, in a sense, bring about a new arrangement in which the interests of finance on the one hand and the interests of the people on the other would be sought to be reconciled in a new kind of social contract, which would mean some loss as far as finance is concerned, as far as this hegemony is concerned. Now, I read out something which I just noticed a couple of days ago. This is a quotation: "Radical reforms reversing the prevailing policy direction of the last 4 decades will need to be put on the table. Governments will have to accept a more active role in the economy. They must see public services as investments rather than liabilities, and look for ways to make labor markets less insecure." Remember, we have been talking about labor market flexibility that would make labor markets more insecure. "Redistribution will again be on the agenda. The privileges of the elderly and wealthy in question. Policies until recently considered eccentric, such as basic income and wealth taxes, will have to be in the mix." That quotation is not from any JNU professor of economics, as many may imagine. That quotation is from the Financial Times editorial of April 3rd. Now, the point is that many people, therefore, have even coined the term that bourgeois socialism, that actually now within the bourgeoisie itself, within the capitalist class itself, there are people who are coming out with these ideas which in a certain sense hark back to socialist ideas that had gone out of fashion in the last 4 decades, but they are becoming fashionable not just among socialists, but actually even in the highest circles of the bourgeoisie. Now, obviously, this is something. So when the ad hoc period of tinkering around with the current kind of globalization, which basically means current neoliberal policies, ad hoc measures, like enlarging the fiscal deficit, commandeering private hospitals. When all this is over, the world we go back to is one which, according to some, would be an authoritarian world in which the workers would be suppressed, in which finance would continue to have its freedom. That's one kind of vision, one kind of strategy, one kind of perspective, which our government shares, and which is necessarily an authoritarian perspective. The other is to work out some kind of a regime that would entail a withdrawal from this kind of absolute hegemony that finance had all this time. Now, obviously, in this, one would like to, take a position which is the same as that of the second perspective. Namely, one would really like a situation where some of these reforms are carried out, in which an attempt is made towards a new social contract, in which an attempt is made towards a more humane order and so on. But the problem with this is that while I support it wholeheartedly, and everybody has to, any reasonable person has to, that's a way of defending democracy. The problem is that finance is not going to give up its hegemony, its dominant position without a fight. That essentially this view is one which is very similar to, it recaptures the kind of view that Keynes had of capitalism. Now, Keynes basically, Keynes, as you remembered, had said that, look, unemployment is a terrible thing, and therefore we have to get rid of unemployment. And it seems to me the only way you can get rid of unemployment is through state intervention. And he was actually opposed to socialism. His argument was that unless you do all this, the socialists would take over. But on the other hand, it's not necessary to have state ownership of the means of production in order to have full employment. You can have full employment through sufficient government expenditure, or what he calls socialization of investment. Now, the problem with Keynes is that, there were two basic problems with Keynes. The first problem is that he was of the view, okay, the first problem, which is an easier one, which I've already discussed, is that there is a jurisdictional problem, that who's the state? Who's going to intervene? That has to be the nation state. And that nation state cannot intervene if that nation state is confronted with globalized finance. So the first thing is that finance has to be controlled, restricted, if you like, which corresponds to the domain of the jurisdiction of the state. So that is number one, which Keynes tried to do in the Bretton Woods system and so on. The second problem with his reform was that he was of the view that if only you explained it to everybody, if people got to know that yes, this is the way that economies can actually reach full employment and so on, then they would all accept it. Because after all, who doesn't want full employment? More profits are generated, more wage bill is generated, more employment is generated. So he was of the view that this is a situation in which everybody would accept it, and all that they lack is simply the theory on how to get to it. I have given you the theory, now you get to it. As a matter of fact, he completely underestimated the fundamental class interests of the different sections, the dominant class interests, particularly the interests of finance. He thought, he actually said the world is ruled by ideas. Ideas rule the world, but on the other hand, he was actually mistaken in that, because there are material interests which actually determine which are the dominant ideas. The dominant ideas which appear to be ruling the world dominate the world, not because they are correct ideas, but because they are backed by material interests which are more powerful. As a result, there is a complete underestimation in this perspective, which I'm talking about, which I wholeheartedly support, about the kind of opposition that would be put up by financial interests. Now, against that opposition, therefore, you have to remain steadfast. And when that opposition comes, then you will have to wage a struggle against that opposition, which means you have to wage a struggle against finance. Take a very simple example. Say in our own country, suppose tomorrow we have a government that decides to give much larger transfers to the people who are suffering, the migrant workers, the poor, the working people who are starving and hungry and so on. Suppose the government decides to give the transfers. Every economist worth the name has been demanding transfers of some kind or the other. Suppose the government actually decides to do that. The moment you do that, you are going to exceed all fiscal deficit targets and this and that. You are going to have a very substantial increase in the government's borrowing, possibly from the Reserve Bank of India, which means monetized deficit. The moment you do that, then finance is going to oppose to it. Your credit rating agencies would actually downgrade your credit rating, and you'd find that the outflow of finance, which is already happening, as I've been telling you, would actually greatly increase. And when it greatly increases, to some extent, we can manage with our reserves. We have $500 billion of foreign exchange reserves. But on the other hand, we shouldn't waste all of that simply in financing a capital outflow. we should preserve some of it. And that being the case, sooner or later, we would require additional resources, non-reserve resources, in order to do something about this outflow. Now, at that point, if you go to anybody for a loan, then all loans would be associated with conditions. All loans would have to be repayable. All loans would be associated with conditionalities and so on, arm twisting of various kinds. It is important, therefore, for us at that stage to put capital controls, that we don't allow capital just to move out at its own sweet will. We actually try and impose controls on financial outflows. The moment we impose controls on financial outflows, then of course it will be more difficult for us to manage our balance of payments. And when that happens, then we may have to impose controls, trade controls on our imports, to make sure that we actually import as much as we can manage to pay for. Now, at that point, there would be all kinds of problems arising, because the United States may then come and start arm twisting the government of India. But fundamentally, all that course of action would mean is getting out of this syndrome of contemporary globalization. Because contemporary globalization, of course, means globalization of finance above all. It also basically means free flow of, relatively free flow of goods and capital and so on across borders. Now, if you start putting controls on those things, which would become essential controls on free flow of goods into the country, controls on free flow of capital out of the country, in that case, you are delinking yourself from globalization. Therefore, this idea that, okay, within the existing structures of globalization, we can work out a new social contract where we can finance and the interests of people, is something which would be very good if it can happen. But it suffers from the same problem that Keynesian theory suffered from. If it is the case that you can actually have full employment simply by government spending, well and good. But on the other hand, it suffers from ignoring the kind of struggles that dominant classes put up in defending their interests. And therefore, insofar as the current globalization is one which is associated with the domination of finance, any effort at changing that current globalization, bringing about policy changes in a direction which I just read out, which Financial Times had actually suggested in April 3rd, would one that would be met with opposition of finance, at which point we shall have to think in terms not only from delinking from globalization, but having an completely alternative basis for organizing our economy, for organizing our growth, and so on. And therefore, that would mean much more than simply putting forward an agenda of this kind, which actually harks back to the 1960s and early 70s. I think that's a period which you cannot just recapture. That's a period which is gone. Finance is much stronger today, would put up much more fights today, and therefore we'll have to move further onwards. I think I should probably stop there and take some questions. I hope I've made myself clear. I'm always terrified that maybe my argument is not clear, but I hope I have made it clear. I'd like to take some questions.
Well, I'm sure everybody would agree. It was a delight to listen to you, Prof. Unfortunately, your video was off, but your audio, your voice was very, very clear. So, now finally we see you. But
Oh, excellent. Okay.
it was very clear. I think everybody was too engrossed in listening to you. We have about 300 viewers, uh, but everybody was just completely engrossed in listening to you. So we'll have to give them some time to put questions. I think people are still going to take a few minutes to formulate the questions and put them down, but. Uh, uh, I hope people are doing that. Uh, you can write your questions. You can write your questions on the YouTube comments. Yeah. Well, while we are waiting
Ah,
for comments from the audience, maybe I should ask one. Uh,
why don't you? Yeah, yeah.
yeah, I was just thinking, Prof. And when you said that obviously the finance is not going to give up without fight, there is also this other aspect to this. The problem is, for example, in India and in fact in many countries, the kind of controls and restrictions that have been put in place to sort of in an attempt to contain the spread of COVID pandemic also in some ways restricts our ability to
Oh,
fight this
yes,
back too. Now,
yes, yes.
what does that mean? What does that mean
Yes.
for the
Yeah.
resistance
Mhm.
to the onslaught of
Yeah, behind these controls which have been placed, you actually are suppressing mass movements. That these controls are not only for medical reasons, but actually they have been utilized for all kind of other purposes by authoritarian governments, because they actually prevent people from coming together to struggle. But the point is that that this is not. I'm not thinking in terms of immediately what is on the agenda. I'm talking about essentially, to put my argument differently, I'm talking about three alternative ways at the current juncture, three alternative ways forward. One is the authoritarian way, if you like, the fascist way, which is to retain the hegemony of finance, but to suppress the people because of the conflict that has taken place between the or that exists. The second is a sort of Keynesian social democratic way, which with their objectives I'm in complete sympathy, but on the other hand, they do not show any kind of awareness of the necessity for class struggle. The third is the socialist way, which is the one that I was talking about. That would entail struggle because you see, economists, intellectuals writing letters to the government, please make some transfers available to the people, can go only up to this point, but not beyond. Ultimately, the people have to be mobilized to struggle for this. Not just immediately. I agree with you. Immediately, the scope for that is very limited. But on the other hand, the immediate restrictions are going to be lifted. And when they are lifted, then of course, you would have the people asserting themselves much more openly. Mind you, it is an irony of the situation that now, when you have such draconian lockdown, people are really in large numbers, migrant workers in large numbers at bus stands and railway stations and so on, wanting to go back to their villages. So this draconian thing has actually produced its own opposite in a way. But of course, when this is lifted, then the possibility of struggles, mobilizations would become greater.
Okay, so there is one question. Uh,
Yes.
Somebody who wants you to explain what is finance or international finance. Yeah,
Okay, let's begin from a very concrete example. Okay, of finance.
philosophy.
Because what does a bank do? The bank gets hold of deposits and the bank actually hands over advances to all credit to all kind of people. It appears to be an intermediary. But on the other hand, whom it advances credit to makes a big difference. Now, suppose it is now similarly at the international level. Suppose India, as I said, suppose there is capital flight out of India. Now, India would like to uh, get some money because our balance of payments would be immediately in great difficulty. So we will have to go and go to some banks which have foreign exchange and okay, you see, so finance is the ultimate decider who gets the credit, who gets the loan, and whoever gets the loan manages in some sense to cope with a crisis. Whoever doesn't get the loan does not manage. And then for giving the loan, they put all kinds of conditionalities, all kinds of conditions. And those conditions are typically at the expense of the people. That's what I mean by saying the difference between the interests of finance and the interests of the people. Finance, for instance, would like to give a loan on very high interest rates. Okay. Now, if you have very high interest rates, then it's bad for the country because the country has to pay back the loan at high interest rates. Finance may be unaware. I mean, may not be convinced that the country has sufficient capacity to.
There are several questions around
Yeah.
finance. When we've reached a state that finance is the main funding agencies of political parties or government, it is understandable the allegiance, how to break the chain. Anvesh is asking if the social democracy approach of a welfare state is widespread enough. Could it be possible that globalized finance takes a backseat, or and we go back to the policy approach of the 50s and the 60s? To what extent does the Chinese state control the tendency of globalized finance to move in and out?
Sorry.
What is it that enables the Chinese state to reining the hegemonic tendencies of the global finance?
Yeah,
And
let's actually just take these first. Um, okay, Chinese state, I mean, China is not one which actually allows free flow of finance into and out of the country. In other words, there are all kinds of restrictions. They never opened their economy. Uh, Sell your, then you'll have to, let's say, sell your asset. If you're going to take out in dollars because you had brought in some dollars, then you can sell it only to somebody who brings in dollars again. So there is no question of an outflow of China. So if you are a foreigner who had brought in dollars and want to take out dollars, in that case, you would be able to do so only if you find another foreigner who is bringing in dollars to whom you can sell your asset. So China never fully went in for the kind of being subject to financial outflows and inflows the way that we did. Uh, that's how they can rein in finance. The other question about um, uh, classes. Okay. You see, which are the classes? I mean, obviously, in any such struggle against the hegemony of finance, you will have to have the working class, the peasants, the agricultural laborers, the fishermen, the kind of craftsmen, and so on. Obviously, all of them mobilized together with small capital, together with even sections of capital which may come with you. But the bulk of the Indian big capitalists are themselves globalized. They're really part of the global financial elite because they also dabble in finances. They go and invest in European countries and so on. And so they are themselves a part of this globalized finance. And it is in their interest to, to retain this kind of a free flow of finance into and out of the country. And therefore, they would be opposed to you. So essentially, in any such struggle, it will be globalized finance together with its local corporate financial elite allies on the one side, and presumably as much of the rest of society as you can organize on the other side. It's not going to be an easy struggle, and I'm not saying that the struggle is going to happen tomorrow, but the thing is that is the direction that we have to look at. But fundamentally, since we are talking about globalization and the pandemic, the effect of the pandemic is to show the essential impossibility of continuing with globalization as we have been doing till now. Now, in that, there is a fascist possibility, there is a Keynesian social democratic possibility, and of course, it seems to me that if the first, then there is the whole question of um, yeah, if finance finances all the political parties, in that case, naturally, how can you expect any position to finance? Absolutely right. Absolutely right. But on the other hand, we must not slip into simple conspiracy theories. In countries, for instance, where political parties are not overtly financed by big finance, even when you have a left-wing government coming into power, like in Greece, when Syriza came into power, the power of the finance is such that the transitional difficulties of leaving that arrangement are so formidable that even the left-wing formation might actually succumb to to the pressure. So it is not only that, okay, you're right, that is the immediate thing. Obviously, all these fellows are getting money from big business, from those who are aligned to the financial, to globalized finance, therefore they're not going to do anything about it. But even if among them there were people who were honest, even if left-wing people come to power, nonetheless there is a structural constraints, and we must not lose sight of that. That's why I was talking on the structural constraint.
Yeah, so there are two questions, one by Manish and one by Shubhanil,
Uh,
somewhat similar. What is the possibility of survival of international institutions after Corona crisis? USA has become the first to raise the question on UN institutions such as WHO. Shubhanil asks, what would be the post-COVID political trajectory in the world? Given that the left is weak in almost all countries, is there a possibility of the right wing strengthening itself in the post-COVID?
well, you can see that that an effort would be made cannot continue. Okay, and if the existing arrangements cannot continue, then of course there is a real danger of a movement in a fascist direction. Where basically the existing arrangements continue. They continue by compromising with democracy. They continue by having governments elected not because of what they do for the people, but because they split the people along communal racist lines and so on. That's one real possibility. Several countries of the world are going in that direction, and of course, many people see that as a fallout of this kind of lockdown that we have been having. But the other is, of course, in a socialist direction. I mean, in some sense, just as Keynes had said, that look, you listen to me, you socialize investment, otherwise you would be having to socialize your means of production. Likewise, in a sense, people like Financial Times are saying that, look, you better listen to us and do all these, otherwise the socialists would actually become relevant again. By the way, the existing weakness of the socialists means nothing, because these things can change very quickly. In fact, just as the existing weakness of the fascists means nothing. I mean, Hitler got 2% of votes in just 2 years before he came to power, and suddenly it increased to 40%. Likewise, you look at the voting percentage that Syriza got, it just suddenly dramatically increased. So in such situations, I think the existing weaknesses and so on don't mean anything. uh, People can, I mean, things can really grow very quickly. But it seems to me that logically these are the kinds of alternatives that we have to face. Uh, okay, now if it is, I mean, okay, Shubhanil's question about what kind of post-COVID institutions and policies. Now, I think that is something which is very related to which of these tendencies is going to really get the upper hand. I mean, it seems to me in some sense that we are actually in a world which is reminiscent of the post-First World War period. That that nothing was settled. Everything was subject to change, subject to actually visualize a set of institutions that capitalism can throw up in order to sustain its kind of I mean life on the basis of some kind of a new social contract with the workers. I mean, A, it's not possible, and B, I believe the contradictions are so serious that none of this is sustainable. So I would not like to talk about the institutions because that will be betraying my own convictions. Um, the other question was, yeah, similar. I mean, my answer would be very similar, namely post-COVID policy. What kind of, um, I believe, again, it is, certainly these are policies, which is why, immediately these would be policies which would bring relief to the people. But on the other hand, obviously, this relief to the people has to be sustained on the basis of an alternative trajectory of development, which is different from the neoliberal trajectory of development, which actually has brought distress to the people.
There's one question that you are portraying finance as a villain. How would we fill in the domestic investment gap that is raised through financial inflows if it
If
was
if
not
it
for the?
You see, if it is the case that the Keynesian social democratic trajectory works out, okay, let's see if it works out. But my own belief as a socialist is that it would not. You know, for neoliberal policies, let's say in India began, neoliberal policy in India began, let's say, in 1991, that is 30 years. Now, India got independent in 1947. Let's say 1951 we take as a starting point. For 40 years, we had strong capital controls, very strong capital controls. You know, I mean, it was so, it's unimaginable, and people often don't realize how strong our capital controls were. And we were financing our investment. We didn't require a kind of speculative money to come into the country, which can leave at any moment. And we didn't have to appease financiers by changing policies according to their whims and caprices in order to finance our investment. So let's be very clear that it's not necessary that we actually can raise our investment only through the help of finance. Secondly, it's not even necessary for us. I mean, look, the all trajectory of development. For instance, in the colonial economy that India had, you had to have big ports because of the fact that actually all the jute and the cotton and so on had to be exported, and the imported manufactured goods had to come in. Prior to that, you didn't require that many ports or that large ports. So the kind of infrastructure you require is itself something which is dependent on the kind of trajectory you're thinking of. Now, if we think of an alternative trajectory to the neoliberal one, then the investment intensity of that trajectory itself is likely to be much less, because all these neoliberal things requires huge infrastructure investment and so on. Therefore, let's not worry about how to finance the investment, and let's not worry about for both these reasons. Firstly, we can do it on the basis of our own resources. We can cut our coat according to our cloth. And secondly, the kind of coat we require, it still depends on the kind of trajectory we have.
In fact, there is a related question by Malini. In the case of
Ah,
India, the
uh,
focus right now is on increasing the fiscal deficit and mainly through monetized deficit.
that's
Please
right.
elucidate why we cannot impose wealth tax immediately.
No. I completely agree we have to impose wealth tax, but we can impose wealth tax on the basis of, I mean, when all this lockdown is lifted. But my point is that if we are thinking in terms of transfers being made available to the people immediately, within the next week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, in that case, obviously, wealth tax revenue would not come in. At the moment, even the tax compliance itself has to be relaxed because people can't fill in their forms, and so on. So immediate money has to be obtained by borrowing from the Reserve Bank of India, by printing money. But of course, once this immediate need is over, we can have a supplementary budget, and in the supplementary budget, we can actually impose wealth. We must impose wealth tax. Must impose wealth tax, because, by the way, fiscal deficit is something which is not a good idea, not for the reasons that all these economists who are committed to the interests of finance say, namely it'll crowd out and private investments on. All that is complete rubbish. Fiscal deficit is a bad idea because fiscal deficit increases wealth inequality. It puts in private hands an amount of claims upon the government, directly or indirectly, which is exactly equal to the fiscal deficit if you leave aside foreign transactions. So the point is that, since if you leave aside foreign transactions, total investment must equal total savings in the economy. If the government's investment exceeds its savings, then the private sector's savings automatically exceed its investment by an equal amount. So if the first is financed by a fiscal deficit, then it ipso facto places claims in government hands of an exactly equal order. And who are the people in whose hands it places these claims? Obviously, those who are the savers, who actually have high incomes. And that being the case, it increases wealth inequality. So if you have fiscal deficit for the time being, that must be followed by wealth taxation. And it's a shame and disgrace that in India we have no wealth taxation. I mean, that's immediately required. So that being the case, I agree with you, except that in the immediate next week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks, we need to borrow from the Reserve Bank.
I must remind everybody that we also have a lecture tomorrow by Professor C.P. Chandrasekhar precisely on this question, where's the money? So please do come back tomorrow to listen to that lecture. In the meanwhile, Prof, there are a few questions on the whole,
Yes,
migration, reverse migration of informal
yes,
workers that has taken place, the
yes,
the possibility of social unrest that may happen because of the whole distress that the working people are going through,
yeah.
and people want to know what do you think, could that what would it mean for the finance capital, and what would it mean for the country?
First and foremost, I would like social unrest. In fact, the tragedy of our country is that there's not enough social unrest. That actually people, I mean, look at demonetization. I wish demonetization had produced unrest. People suffered enormous amounts. But on the other hand, there was not as much of a noise as you would normally have expected, because social unrest is a symptom of people asserting themselves, fighting for their rights. And it's a pity that we don't have enough social unrest. In fact, my teacher, Amartya Sen, used to say that we have to generate among people anger, because otherwise, I mean, they just suffer in silence. Now, I think, that's a good idea. The good thing is there's social unrest. We should not be worried about that. Migration, one of the things about migration, which is really quite striking, is that we keep talking about how much growth rate we have had, how the economy has got diversified, and how we have become modern. We have become kind of whatever, become an economic superpower and so on. Trillion, $5 trillion economy, and all the rest of it. But the fact of the matter is that agriculture still remains the basic area, the basic source of support for millions of people who may not be engaged in agriculture. A very well-known communist leader I used to know used to say that even the industrial working class in India has not completely severed its roots. Bombay textile workers have not completely severed their roots from their rural backgrounds. And which is why, in periods of prolonged strikes, they would just simply go back to their villages. So the importance of villages, the importance of agriculture is something which has to be appreciated, notwithstanding all this talk about, 5 trillion and this and that. And for that, therefore, it also becomes important that actually development of agriculture, having a much higher rate of growth of incomes in the hands of the peasants and laborers, is ultimately the real index of development in this country. Okay, not 7, 8, 10% growth rates of GDP. So I think the migration has actually brought that very much into the open. The other thing that it has actually brought into the open is the magnitude of poverty in the country, the magnitude of hunger in the country. I mean, that this is something which was not, everybody thought that, okay, poverty has disappeared and so on, based entirely on false statistical criteria. But on the other hand, you suddenly realize what an extremely poor country this is. As a matter of fact, this whole glitz and glamour of the neoliberal period, in which you have this supposedly very high rates of growth. We don't know how much they are, but supposedly very high rates of growth. But that has only produced an enormous social and economic hiatus between a small elite on the one side, and of course vast numbers of poor people on the other. And the poor people are uncomplaining, and therefore we just assume that they must be also benefiting from this that is going on.
Well, thank you, Prof. Thank you for this wonderful lecture and for taking the questions. And thank you, everybody, for joining in. It's been a wonderful session. I'm sure you'll all agree. It almost reminded us of a talk like this would have happened in Triple S1 committee room in JNU. But since we can't have that, this was not bad. So thank you very much. Let me just remind everybody, we have Professor C.P. Chandrasekhar tomorrow at the same time, 5:30 p.m. And he'll be speaking on addressing the pandemic. Where's the money? I hope to see you all tomorrow here. Have a nice evening. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.